Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I'd appreciate it if you left this video a like, and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And today I am doing another episode of quick album reviews. I will be talking about 7 different albums in succession, and hopefully keeping my thoughts as brief and concise as I can without going into too much crazy detail, but if I have more to say about an album, then I will. So, without further ado, let's not waste any more time. We got 7 new albums to talk about, so let's get started with the first album I will be discussing. And first, I want to talk about the newest album from Miley Cyrus entitled Endless Summer Vacation. Now, this has definitely been one of the more hyped albums of the year, especially coming from a big artist like Miley, who only seems to be becoming bigger with each new album she releases, and she had a pretty lucrative hit on this one in Flowers, which is still doing very well on the Billboard Hot 100. Personally, that one doesn't stand out to me as much as I would like it to, and unfortunately, I feel like that is reflective of a lot of this album. It's not entirely middle of the road. In fact, I would say it is a step above average because of some select songs. For an example, I think the song River is a lot of fun, and that really should have been the lead single on this album if I had my way, and I think Miley clearly saw that that song was doing well fan-wise and was a fan favorite, so it doesn't surprise me that that one became the second single, and I do prefer that one a lot more. I think it has a lot more energy to it and has a pretty fun vibe to it. I also really like Violet Chemistry. That one is probably my favorite on the album. I just think this song is a lot of fun, has a really cool 80s groove to it too that I really enjoy. Handstand is also a very intriguing song, probably the most experimental I've heard Miley go, and it's definitely a weird one. It's definitely one that takes some getting used to, and I could see some people thinking of this song as sort of messy, and to be honest, I could see where those people are coming from. Wildcard is another late album highlight for me, and I really do enjoy Miley's voice on this one. Her voice has a lot of the rock grit to it, which is something that I feel like this album is sorely missing in a lot of places where it was more present on Plastic Hearts, which was personally to me a lot more of a fun album, and Wildcard is one of the few times where I feel like we see that fun energy returning back. Now, I think the main issue with this album is that it's a little dull in a lot of places. Like I said, the rock energy that Plastic Hearts had is gone, the pop rock energy I should say, and while I'm not expecting her to do a rock album every time, and I don't even think that she would because she's always changing up her sound, I do think that Miley is not as invested on this album as I would want her to be, especially in the backing musicality of many of the songs. Rose-Colored Lenses is definitely one of the weaker songs on the album, if not the weakest, with it relying on this dream pop vibe, and I just don't think it gets there, and honestly, Miley's voice sounds a little bit awkward against this soundscape to me. If I am being honest, I don't really care for it as much, and I don't think it works here. 1,000 Miles is pretty disappointing with featuring Brandi Carlile, but doesn't even really get her a chance to have her vocals shine. Island is trying to go for, fittingly, a sort of island soft rock vibe, but it is probably the most boring song here. I just do not care for this one at all. And Muddy Feet is a very awkward song with a Sia feature that feels very ill-placed, and I'm not sure what the song was trying to do, to be honest. Thankfully, the album does end off pretty strongly with Wonder Woman, which, not just because it has an album or a song title similar to Casey Musgrave's song, but it does remind me of Casey Musgraves quite a bit, and I say that as a compliment. And I generally think this song does, at least in the album, on a pretty strong note. Along with the Flowers demo that might make me appreciate the song Flowers a little more, I actually like the demo a little better and feel like it has a more raw feeling to it. But overall, this album is just fine to me. I don't hate it, I don't love it, and I do think it is a bit of a step down from Plastic Hearts, but there are some highlights on this one, so I would say pick and choose those, and you can probably skip the rest of the album, but once again, this is just my opinion, so yeah, let me know your thoughts on this album. 3 out of 5 stars for this one for me. Next, let's talk about the newest album from All Time Low, Tell Me I'm Alive. I was pretty excited about this album, especially coming off of what was perhaps one of their best late album highlights in Wake Up Sunshine, an album that I think brought back their pop punk strengths and is definitely one of their top 3 albums still, in my opinion. I absolutely love what that album does, but I'm sort of disappointed to say that I think Tell Me I'm Alive is a step down. It's not what I would call a huge step down, but it is a noticeable one. This album does go back to embracing some of the more poppy tendencies that they had on the album Last Young Renegade, although I don't feel it's nearly as obnoxious as that one. In fact, I would call this album a much lesser version of Future Hearts in my opinion, because it does have more of the pop rock sounds of that album, but I feel like it embraces much more of the pop aspects that Future Hearts was going for, except it just doesn't do them nearly as well as that album did, and for that reason I just didn't really vibe with much of this album and found it to be pretty basic. The lyrics also felt pretty sophomoric and underwritten compared to their previous album. An example of this to me is Calm Down. I really wish I did like this song because I vibe with the message of it, but I feel like the message isn't done as well as it could be because the lyrics aren't really hitting as hard as I would want them to, and musically the song plays it surprisingly soft considering the subject matter is something that Alex is angry about. New Religion is very cliched. It has this subject matter of being in a relationship with someone and treating the other person like your religion, like you're obsessed with them, you worship them, using all those cliched metaphors that you've heard time and time again. And while the song is one of the more energetic on the album, lyrically it just falls very flat for me, and I think the closing track, Lost Along the Way, is pretty uninteresting too. But there are some album highlights on here. For example, I know that a lot of people didn't really enjoy Sleepwalking, the lead single, but that might actually be one of my favorites on the album. I think it is one of the few that does the pop vibes pretty well, and I think it has a pretty fun synth line going on in it that I really enjoyed. I also think that The Other Side is a great song, probably the best on the album. This one has the pop punk energy that Wake Up Sunshine had, and I really wish more songs had this type of just kinetic energy to it, because this one really goes off the chains. And then English Blood and American Heartache is a pretty cool song too, and I imagine that a lot of people might consider this one of their favorites by All Time Low because it definitely brings back more of a classic All Time Low feel. Overall, I do think this album is a bit of a step down from Wake Up Sunshine, and I just don't think that it hits as well as I would want it to. Most of the cuts here are pretty just uneventful, I think, and they really do play it safe on this album, I think, and don't take as many risks as they could. Even production-wise, it does feel like a step down, and the energy just doesn't hit as hard as I would want it to. So, light 3 out of 5 stars for this one. I really did wish I liked this one better. This was a bit of a disappointment to me. Next up is an album where I really don't have a whole lot to say about it, but it is by the country artist Dierks Bentley, who is one country artist that even before I wasn't into country, I did generally enjoy him, but I have sort of gained a new appreciation for him in rediscovering country, and while I wouldn't say he's like a top tier for me, I do see his talent for sure. Traveling Gold is definitely much more of a bona fide country album, and it is very comfortably country too, I would say. It's not necessarily taking any new types of risks in terms of what Bentley is talking about. Lots of the same stuff that he's done in the past, and I mean, he even comments on this on the first song, Same Old Me, where he's talking about this is still him. This is who he is. He's always been this way. He's always talked about this stuff, and he's happy to continue to be the same person. He's proud of who he is, and he's proud of what he has done as an artist. And I like that. I think that's good. Something Real also works really well as a very strong song subject-wise, where he talks about how he feels like the fact that he is a radio-ready artist doesn't make him able to talk about some deeper subject matter that he would want to, and basically he's setting out on this album to actually try and talk about something real. Cowboy Boots might be my favorite on the album, as this is just an absolutely gorgeous duet between him and Ashley McBryde, who just both work very well on this song, and I think across the board this song is just excellent, and it's by far one of my favorite songs of the year. Also, High Note is just excellent. A great way to end the album, and a huge album highlight as well, with just a very fun instrumental that brings almost a folk country feel to the album. I suppose Gold is maybe a little cliched, and as a single didn't really work for me as well. Old Pickup also has a lot of the country cliches that you would expect, and even Roll On doesn't work for me as well as I would want it to, but overall, I think this is a pretty good country album and shows that this genre has plenty to offer and that Dierks Bentley himself has plenty to offer too. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars for me for this album. I would check it out if I were you. Next up is a new album by Gideon, More Power, More Pain. To be honest, I wasn't expecting that I'd be talking about this album because Gideon as a band, their last album just did not work for me at all. I did not like it. I considered it to be one of the worst albums of the year it came out, but this album has got to be one of the most pleasant surprises of the year because I had a great time with this. Gideon is still very much so a hardcore band, but they embrace some new metal tendencies on this album too, and this is not your typical hardcore album by any means. I feel like there's a lot more going on this album, especially in the second half, where they embrace some legitimately great guitar riffs that go beyond just your typical hardcore stuff. I really do think this album works because it is anchored down by a pretty cohesive message, or a pretty cohesive concept rather, where the lead singer is talking about his journey and trying to be fitting into his father's footsteps, into his father's shoes. He feels like he's always been pressured to be an artist like his dad was, and because of that, that created a lot of self-doubt in him, which he explores over and over on each song here. And through this, you also see his struggles with mental health and with loss, and it turns into an album that is pretty vulnerable when you look at the lyrics, and pretty heartbreaking in places, especially on a song like If You Love Me, Let Me Go, which for all its grit has a lot of heartbreak hidden underneath it that I think really works well. But there's also, of course, some very fun songs that are being motivational and actually work and don't feel cheesy in their motivation, like Take Off, which is by far my favorite on the album and one of my favorite songs of the year, with a chorus that is very catchy in its sort of scream singing vibe that it's going for, along with the final nail, which probably has some of my favorite guitar work on the album. But don't go without missing those classic metal feeling songs that are really surprising on this album, like Midnight Blue, or even Damned If I Do, Damned If I Don't, where you see a lot more going on than you would expect. Even I Will Carry You has a really cool vibe to it that I really liked, and it was pretty cool to see this album go on this interesting journey where it started off with more of what you would expect from Gideon with the first half of the album, but then the second half shifts into something else entirely. And I think this album is exactly what they needed. They needed something that could show that they could take their sound a step further, and I think they did that with this release. This is a really strong album, and one that I think I'll be returning to fairly often because it has a really fun sound to it, and there's a lot of songs that are just begging to be played on repeat. Strong 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. Next, I'm going to talk about the newest Gorillaz album, Cracker Island. Now, Gorillaz is a band that I have been trying to get into this year, especially because I've never necessarily gotten the hype behind them, and I've never really been able to vibe with them, but after getting into their discography this year, while I would not say that I am a one-over fan by any means, I definitely see why people really like them. I would say that Cracker Island is definitely a step up from that album. I think it's taking what the Now Now did with a much more relaxing synth pop vibe and bringing a bit more energy to it while still keeping some of that relaxed feeling intact. It's also expanding on the Gorillaz lore a little bit from what I understand, and while I don't necessarily get their lore, I will be frank about that. I don't really understand the story behind their albums or the cartoon characters within this world. I'm sure fans will really enjoy that. Cracker Island sees Gorillaz collaborating with Thundercat, and it is an excellent collaboration. This one is definitely my favorite on the album, so the album gets off to a pretty dang strong note with that song, and I just really like the vibe of this one. Thundercat's voice is a match made for the synth pop vibe this song is going for, along with the incorporation of just some delightfully beautiful guitar work from him that is excellent. And Damon Albarn's voice works pretty well his lower register against Thundercat's much more higher register. Their contrasting sounds make for a vibe that is really fun. Oil is also pretty great with a very strong feature from Stevie Nicks, and New Gold, man, Tame Impala being on a Gorillaz song is something that is so obvious. I'm surprised that Gorillaz hasn't done it earlier from what I can remember, but they work super well on this song. And Possession Island with Beck is also a solid track. Now, this album isn't entirely perfect by any means. I do think it is a little short, and while I actually am okay with the Gorillaz album being short, because a lot of them run a little bit long to me, I do think that the album loses a little bit of its momentum, especially in the second half, and that can make the second half not really stand out. Tormenta with Bad Bunny, for example, doesn't work as well as I would want it to. Even though I don't mind Bad Bunny's vocals on this song, it feels a little bit awkward. And Skinny Ape is a song that I just think is a little bit eye-roll worthy more than anything else, and probably rings as the weakest song here to me. I do think this is a solid album with an especially strong first half that really has a lot of good stuff going for it. So I would still recommend this album, and it might be one of the better Gorillaz albums for me, at least. I know a lot of people consider this a weaker one in their discography, but as far as for me, and I do still need to give their older albums more listens to be for sure, but I do like this one better than a lot of their new releases. In fact, this might be their best one, for me at least, post-Humans. And that's why I'm going to be giving this album a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next, let's talk about Haken's newest album, Fauna, which was definitely one of my most anticipated albums of this year, especially with hearing the songs Nightingale and Taurus, which showed them going for a more vibrant sound than they had on Virus. While I really do think the dark sound of Virus worked very well for the 2020 landscape, and that album only rings more true and is very much a sort of marker of that time period and of the COVID timeline, I do like that Haken is embracing a more vibrant sound on this album. Sempiternal Beings, for an example, which is just a superb song that is definitely one of my favorites of the year. I love how they're grasping with mortality on this song, and the idea of that life is just finite and we need to appreciate it as much as we can. And I think the song ultimately rings out on an optimistic note, which is something that I like across this album. I think across this album there is a lot more optimism on it. Look at a song like Island in the Clouds, which just goes to some insane places that I absolutely love. And I think it's really cool that across this album they're using animals as sort of a representation of different human instincts. I mean, they make this fairly obvious on Taurus, but they continue doing that in pretty cool ways across the album. Nightingale is a pretty interesting track that shows sort of a core thesis of this album, with the fact that they want to continue to stay true to themselves, which means not always staying on the same path sound-wise, and continuing to risk and experiment no matter what the fans might think. Elephants Never Forget is also a super interesting track, which talks about an elephant man and talks about the human condition to judge people who might be different than us. And I think for a lot of people, they're going to be able to find some connection to this and make the metaphor of the elephant man apply to them in some way, shape, or form. And I really appreciate that Haken sort of develops that metaphor in a way to where it could apply to a lot of different types of things. This album does not have that many weak moments to it. I really enjoyed this. I think maybe the only moments that didn't quite work for me was maybe Love Bite, which, while I appreciate that this song is going for a much more accessible radio feel, does feel maybe a little bit out of place in context of the album. And I also think that Eyes of Ebony is maybe not the strongest way that the album could have closed, but nevertheless, I think this is a very strong album with a lot of great progressive rock elements, and I just think overall it is one of their stronger albums to date that I've heard. Very strong 4 out of 5 stars for me, definitely one of my favorite albums of the year so far. And finally, I've saved the best for last. Let's talk about Invent Animate's newest album, Heavener, which was definitely another anticipated release for me, but I did not expect how much I would enjoy this album on Heavener. I mean, wow. Invent Animate absolutely won me over with this album yet again. I really like their second album as well, but this one is just on another level for them. Invent Animate has always been a band that has embraced intensity along with beautiful atmosphere, but I think they nail that seemingly disparate combination here really well, and perhaps in the best way that they have ever done, because there are just some incredible moments on here that absolutely blew me away. Plus, this album might have their most emotional arc yet. I would debate that it is, with them talking about the idea of loss in different types of ways, and the fact that there is a human condition to try to find hope or a sense of heaven in the midst of losses. And I'll admit, albums with this type of arc really do work for me. They are albums that I connect with a lot, and I think Invent Animate might nail that arc perhaps the best that I've heard a lot of bands doing it. And I mean, for that reason, it's just such a superb album, and it's going to be hard to beat this year. Then going into Shade Astray, a deeply personal song right after that, feels very fitting, with a sort of breakup that deeply shattered the lead singer, and you can feel that anger and the sorrow of that and all the conflicting emotions combining together, and creates a very catchy Invent Animate song that a lot of fans are going to love, I'm sure. But really, I mean, it's Without a Whisper that hit me the hardest. This song really made me tear up the first time I heard it, because it is so beautiful, and it's just incredible what the band does on this song, and talking about the lead singer losing his grandmother and the feeling of trying to find her in the midst of a very dark world, and trying to find some sense of connection to her. And it makes for such a heart-wrenching song, with a chorus that just goes to new heights each time I hear it. Especially that last iteration of the chorus, which is just so utterly beautiful, and I'm just amazed by what the band accomplishes here. There are still some excellent moments. I think False Meridian gives Without a Whisper a run for its money on the opposite end of the spectrum as a super epic, incredibly intense song with a bridge that just might be one of the best moments of the album, where the guitar riffs just go super intense, contrasted with a just gorgeous atmosphere of singing in the background. I really think the middle run of this album, from Without a Whisper to Immolation of Night, is some of the strongest album run of tracks I've heard all year long. Because then we get into Reverie, which is a straight up ballad, might be Invent Animate's first ballad. In fact, I think it probably is, with entirely clean vocals. And this song is just, I mean, talk about beautiful, just the definition of gorgeous and ethereal. And then right after the most beautiful song of the album, we get what it might be Invent Animate's most intense, an Immolation of Night, where there's just this dark determination to prove yourself, with the lead singer saying "I am enough" over and over again, and it feels practically violent in the way that he's screaming it out, like he almost doesn't believe it himself, but he wants to believe it. And that's what makes the song's power feel that much more gritty and raw. Elysium is a great way to end off this album, once again reinforcing the themes of loss. I almost wonder if Emberglow might have been a little better of a closing track in some ways, because I really like what that song does, and I think it has a lot of the same arcs, and I feel like maybe it could have concluded the album too, but the fact that there are two potentially great closing songs is a huge testament to how great this album is. And I do not really have many problems with this album at all. I mean, the only song that may not work for me, and I'm not even sure if I dislike it by any means, is Void Surfacing. That might be the only one that I would say doesn't work for me as well as I would want it to, but other than that, this album is nearly pitch perfect for me. It works from an emotional perspective. Its album arc is just beautifully realized. The musicality is superb. The way they balance atmosphere with brutality is some of the best I've heard in the metalcore landscape in a long time. And vocally, it's just great. Perhaps this lead singer's best vocal performance I've heard from him. And yeah, it's going to be hard to beat out this album this year. This is definitely an album of the year contender for sure, and it is a very strong one. Strong 4.5 out of 5 stars for me. So yeah, that ends this episode of Quick Album Reviews. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know what your thoughts were on any of the albums I've talked about if you've heard them. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.